So what are we doing today? Is that the question?
Okay, so new food.
Welcome to New Food. Welcome back to New Food.
This is episode 2. Your host, Paul Hagopian. I'm Tam. I'm the producer for this show.
And Tam, what is the point of the show?
We are currently putting together a show to talk about anything that's moving and shaking in the food industry, which is all encompassing. So recently we had Nick Bodkins from Boisson to talk about just the waves in the non-alcoholic and zero proof industry.
Yeah, today we have Ashwinn from TikTok. He's the green screen god. Does a lot of branding breakdowns for consumer goods companies. So a lot of stuff that you'd see at a grocery store. We thought he would be a really good guest on the show because he kind of just understands why we're buying certain things. And I feel like a huge chunk of our buying decisions, especially with food, where you have like this tiny window where you're interacting with something at a grocery store or online, like come down to branding. And I know I pick the things like the olive oil with the best branding. I'm a Graza guy because of it. So hopefully he can glean a little as to maybe like the mechanisms that make that stuff happen.
Yeah, totally. And I think like brand is such like a hot and sexy topic. And so it'll be really interesting to see someone who's so expert on it to just unpack like how those mechanics work.
And he's also dialed in on like TikTok, obviously. And I think he is a big believer in companies like doing TikTok well and how that can drive sales and growth. I mean, he has his own D2C company, Oklahoma Smokes, where he makes TikToks. And I guess from other interviews, I think he said that it's like driven a ton of sales for him just overnight. Hopefully we can kind of understand a bit more about how that stuff works, what are best practices, and maybe we could learn a little bit, honestly.
Well, let's get this thing started. New Food with Paul Hagopian.
And Tam. Listen to some podcasts that you did on Saturday morning while going for a run. Okay. Not my normal, Saturday morning start. Go listen to some podcasts about TikTok, but you're very good at it already. So
Thank you.
It'll be good. All right. So today we are joined by Ashwinn Krishnaswamy, the co-founder of Forge Design, a branding agency that's partnered with companies like Jambies, Muddy Bites, 8 Beer. You're the founder of the nicotine and tobacco-free cigarette brand Oklahoma Smokes, and the owner of one of my favorite accounts on TikTok, a place where you masterfully unpacked how brands kind of position themselves on TikTok, at the grocery store, and kind of anywhere that you can interact with them. Ashwinn, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm going to be stealing that as my bio.
I want to talk about 3 things today. Here's sort of like a table of contents for what we want to do. So number 1, I want to cover how branding impacts my grocery shopping, both online and at the actual store. Number 2, I want to learn just how impactful TikTok can be for a brand, and kind of gather if there's a common denominator for content that seems to resonate with people. And then 3, I want to gather your thoughts and sort of strategies on how food brands that are positioning themselves as either sustainable or they're trying to tackle like an ethical supply chain, how they can position themselves for long-term success. And again, thank you. And so let's kind of just get into it. You talk a lot about brands, like optimizing for the right context. I think for either 8 Beer, Muddy Bites, or any sort of food brand that you've worked with, how would you go about optimizing for the right context if that's a grocery store shelf?
Yeah, so with Muddy Bites is a good example, and they were a client of ours that we actually worked with them on the digital side. So they had their branding done when they had come to us, but they've been great to work with, and we've kind of seen their progress over time. When they first launched their product, they launched just kind of D2C basically. And so they had a larger pouch size. And then they started having conversations with some convenience stores. And the convenience stores basically said, hey, we need a smaller sample size we need a smaller pack size because you are a newer brand. We're trying to drive more kind of impulse purchases. So rather than, 15 bites in a pack, let's have a much smaller pack. Right. And I think even small nuances like that, just like pack size, pack architecture, and knowing for the context that you're going to sell in is really important in designing the right kind of packaging.
Sure. So I want to pull that into more of like a traditional product. So say I'm a pasta company, right? Mm-hmm. What would be sort of like the primary questions that I would need to answer from copy, from branding, to kind of like put myself up with the best chance at a Whole Foods on 22nd Street?
Yeah, I think the first place that you have to start, and I always say this with branding, it is rooted in strategy, not rooted in aesthetics. Okay. So you need to become a master of that category and that shelf space. If you can't stand in front of the pasta aisle and recite to me every single brand and what they're calling out and what the ethos is and how they're driving those sales, then it's going to be challenging for you to become a new entrant in that space. So even understanding the nuances of, hey, are you stacking up against traditional gluten-based, wheat-based pastas, or are you going the gluten-free? Are you going plant-based? Are you going, against bonzas and kind of chickpea and the various ways you can make pasta? So even being able to answer those questions, how you're going to sit on shelves, how are you going to stand out relative to the competition there, is just kind of table stakes starting point.
Sure. And then just by being an agency, I'm sure you work with tons of different verticals, right? So do you have sort of an approach in terms of just the first step that you would take? Where you look to research, is it experimenting with things firsthand? How do you kind of gather that information when you're stepping into something new?
Yeah. So the first place that we start, and we, for the most part, when we work on a new project, we're typically working in that space for the first time. And so our first job is really to do a lot of research and get up to speed on what the competitive landscape looks like, what the form factors look like, who is doing best in class in terms of sales there, and how have they gotten there, and really becoming a kind of expert alongside the team in that space. And that's important for us to be able to then say, okay, here is our insight. Here is how we are going to stand out or build off of a category trend or opportunity here.
Makes sense. And then I feel another thing too, from a TikTok that you did recently, where it was I think the frozen ice pops, right? And in which one you said oat milk, whatever. I feel there's the visual component of hey, I'm walking up in a grocery store, whether I'm tired or not, what I'm seeing. I think maybe could you unpack a bit about what you're considering visually from just that situation where I'm tired, I'm walking by, I have maybe a half a second. What are some of the competing factors in your head there?
So I think what's really important to think about as a kind of brand founder early on is what channels you're going to distribute in. So are you going to first try to get into Whole Foods and Targets or these local grocers, or are you going to run predominantly an e-commerce playbook for the first year, 2 years of your business? And I think that's an important part to understand, because I've kind of talked about the importance of designing for context, right? If you just sell online, you can strip away a lot of information and communication from your packaging and allow that work to be done on the website, your Instagram, all of your social channels. But let's go with this example of, hey, you're a new ice cream brand and you're going to try to sell into grocery stores. I think what is kind of very important there is, what are the kind of symbolic attributes that are going to call people? So for example, in that oat milk example, there is presumably some insight there where that team is saying, hey, we are actually trying to speak to a dairy-free audience or a lactose-free audience. And, oat milk has this nice trend going on here. There aren't too many alternatives in the space that are calling out oat milk. So we're going to make that the primary read when you look at our packaging. And that's a kind of impulsive thing where you're scanning the aisle and you see oat milk and it's like, okay, yeah, let me pick that up and take a look at it.
Totally. But then, so I feel where this becomes complicated for me is I was doing a little bit of research before. And last year, I think 17% of total U.S. grocery sales were online. And that's at places like Amazon, Target, Whole Foods, Fresh Direct, whatever, where the UX is obviously entirely different. And I feel there's a lot of people that are kind of stumbling onto those platforms in grocery. So I'm curious, do those same principles apply there? And how would a food brand, maybe an olive oil, not Grocers, which is I think a bit more brand forward, but someone that's, like a Cento or someone that's been around for a while, they're not really considering that. And then that's now what they're competing with, right? 20% of their sales are probably coming from online. How do they kind of tweak that going forward? And what challenges does that present?
Yeah, I think that, especially for some of these legacy players, you tend to see them get onto Amazon.
Right.
They don't have the most sophisticated owned D2C operation, and that's probably for the best, right? They're capturing consumers who are going on Amazon who are searching for olive oil. There's really high intent, and Amazon is good at capturing that and driving those sales, versus how many people are going to Google and searching Cento olive oil and then going to Cento website and then buying just the olive oil from their website. So I think digital is a channel that is increasingly important for so many of these like legacy grocery brands. And I think they're finding success and realize that they have to be on Amazon, and just kind of developing some of that digital fluency of, okay, well, here's how else we can contextualize our product and kind of drive sales here.
Yeah. And I think it seems like, from my perspective, that the brands that are particularly strong there are the ones that are already strong D2C, right, in other areas. And so, like, do you recognize any that are like particularly strong in that field?
Sorry, particularly strong in
terms of being like an online grocery brand.
There are, probably not from the. I don't have good examples of some of those legacy brands that do really well in terms of online. But I remember, talking to someone about Oats Overnight, and they're just pure play kind of D2C and have been for the past 4 years or so, and are doing quite well there.
Yeah. Interesting. I don't know. I think it's going to just change a lot of stuff. I imagine that there's like a future that might exist where like the world's best like branded cucumbers are the cucumbers that kind of dominate like on a Instacart, but I don't know like how that'll actually end up shake out. So you talk a lot about brands that kind of like can grow through short form video, so long as it's well done, right? And I want to know, like, from personal experience, if you could speak to how a single successful TikTok can drive growth in sales for a business like Oklahoma Smokes or any other ones that you've worked with.
Yeah. So we got on TikTok as Oklahoma Smokes back in late 2020, early 2021. And we had some of our first videos go viral. And when I say viral, 200, 300, 400,000 views, drove several $1,000s in sales overnight, which was great. But to the point where we've had videos that have done, 1 million in views, 2 million in views, that have driven 30,000 overnight, $40,000 in sales overnight, which as a bootstrapped CPG brand, that is significant. That's really significant.
Right.
So I have seen a ton of that for my personal brand. I know Muddy Bites has had a lot of success with TikTok too, and just organic short form content. And so, there can be helpful for a lot of brands.
What are some of the inhibiting factors for brands that are struggling to kind of have that sort of conversion on TikTok? Whether it's like a lack of quality content or strategy or whatnot.
Yeah. So sometimes it's quality of content. Sometimes it's strategy. I think so first and foremost, there are certain products and brands that can inherently do well on these platforms. Low average order value, somewhat of a novel product, somewhat interesting. So Muddy Bites, it's a kind of standalone product that's the bottom of a waffle cone. There was Nerdy Nuts, which was a peanut butter, homemade kind of like peanut butter brand with tons of different flavors, and $8 a jar. So it's like, okay, that's a no-brainer. Sure. I want to try out that limited drop Oreo edition flavor. If you get into things that are, say it's a chickpea pasta, for example, it's a novel product, but there's a lot of competition in that space. And that's the type of product or brand that, hey, we'll probably see some lift in retail, but we won't see that immediate conversion off of necessarily a viral video here on TikTok talking about this pasta.
Gotcha. So, I mean, that was going to be my next question. Like, what food brands do you think are particularly strong there? And I feel like, so the common denominator is what? Like, it's mainly fit, or is it's a kind of a combination of all three? Fit, quality?
Yeah, I think it's kind of novelty of the product and kind of average price point.
Right. And like, I mean, we've been dabbling in TikTok here a lot over the last couple of months. It's obviously very difficult to master, but I feel like you have a really good approach that's kind of transferable for businesses, whether it's green screen, some of the things that you've written about on like how companies can kind of lean into their day-to-day operations and produce like quality content that way. So I kind of wanted to put you to the test with a few business hypotheticals here today, and like just come up with, maybe if you can, a video that you think like can sneak out of there. And these are all sort of like food related ones. So the first one, my brother and I are 3rd generation beet farmers in Pennsylvania. I handle the books. He tends to the land. With our new bed and breakfast, we are the #1 beet related agritourism spot in Northeast PA. What are some of the TikToks that we could make to help us become the best known beet farm in the Mid-Atlantic?
Well, you teed me up with a nice one. I would break down every part of that sentence there and turn that into video. So we're a 3rd generation beet farmer. I'm just going to talk about the history of my family beet farming. That's so kind of esoteric and interesting. We're going to do a video with, my parents and my grandparents talking about being beet farmers. That's kind of just one concept in one video. There's a whole breadth of how we can talk about beet farming and how it's relative to, I don't know, potatoes and carrot farming and these other types of farming. What does a nutritious beet look like versus a non-nutritious beet? What's the perfect time to... So there's this whole angle of education around farming. And what I always say and try to push a brand towards or a creator towards is look at everything that you do on a day-to-day basis and kind of take for granted. So among the beet farming community, you're not going to have these conversations because you're talking about common things that we know, but to an outsider, what are all of these things that are interesting to them? And it turns out it's just my day-to-day as a beet farmer and the things that I'm learning and thinking about, and this is how I harvest my crop of beets. So that's kind of one direction here. The second kind of direction is the ag tourism, the bed and breakfast meets beet farming experience. Is there an experience around that? You come stay at the bed and breakfast and then you go harvest beets. You could do a kind of tours of what that experience looks like. You can do just tours and angles of the bed and breakfast. So those are kind of 3 ways that I would think about this.
Did you ever watch The Office?
Yeah.
So that was Dwight Schrute's farm. So he could have made a fortune if he did it the right way. Okay, here's another one. And I think I want to give you 3 different examples. And so that's a non-retail one. I want to do a B2B, and then I want to do a retail D2C. So this would be sort of your B2B example. So after watching The Bear, I realized my life would be incomplete without somehow working with restaurants. So I recently opened a laundry service that picks up and washes restaurant linens. Can TikTok help my business?
Absolutely. The first place that I'm starting with is kind of shock value videos, especially because the content's going to be so highly visual.
Right.
So it's, you won't, opening video, you won't believe this stain from one of New York's most popular restaurants, or this party of 18 last night did an absolute number on this tablecloth. There's probably so much content around red wine stains and pasta stains in linens where you can be a source of education for here's how I remove those stains, or here's how my company removes those stains. There's this fine line that you can blend between pure play educational of I'm going to teach you how to get a red wine stain out of this linen versus, hey, here's how my company takes out the red wine stain from this restaurant grade linen. We turn it around in 24 hours. So I think that's kind of one direction I would go. Another direction is, hey, picking up linens from all of these restaurant locations. What time do you do that? Do you do that at 2:00 in the morning? Okay, great. Let's do a little bit of a day in the life on the job kind of experience.
And there's, even though 99% of the people watching are not restaurant owners or operators, there is a payoff there, right? There's if one person converts out of I don't know, the 100,000 people that watch that one video, it's worth it? Or how does the input to output ratio work out in your head where it's hey, I'm that guy that runs that linen company. Why should I actually do this?
Yeah, it is. So I think the first thing is a lot of people think that, hey, well, that's somewhat niche content or that's hyper specific content. Who's going to be interested in that? And I think what TikTok has taught me time and time again, both as a creator as well as a consumer, is you can just expand the aperture of people's interests so easily by making mildly interesting content.
I spent a minute last night watching some UFC guy explain to me why I think oak is harder than another wood. I've never built anything in my life.
Yeah.
And I was like, that's fascinating.
And now you're committed to that idea. The number of things that I've just gone down TikTok wormholes because someone just captured me with a video is really interesting. But I guess to this point of kind of balancing conversion versus general broad-based kind of audience. Right. There is content that you can create that's really just kind of this top of funnel stuff that's, hey, I'm going to get a lot of eyeballs on this. It's not necessarily going to drive conversions for my business. And then there's that more there's more niche content that you can put out of, hey, here's our 8-step process for cleaning your restaurant linens, and here's how we get it done in under 12 hours and back to you without ever having any delays. Otherwise, your money back. And it's maybe 3,000 people see that video, but 500 of them are restaurant owners.
Sure. Yeah. You're 2 for 2 right now. So number 3, I think this is a bit more up your alley, but I do think it's kind of like, I feel like this has the most mass. Well, you'll see. So my new beverage is an NA hard kombucha. And we have local success, right? We're in a few, grocery stores in Hartford, Connecticut. How could we use TikTok to scale across New England and then hopefully across the country?
I would start with recording myself sampling this product in grocery stores nearby and just setting up the camera. I'm in the Whole Foods sampling my NA hard
kombucha, essentially White Claw Zero.
Okay, my NA hard kombucha, and I'm doing an entire series of just grocery store interactions, which is probably going to be people saying, "What is NA hard kombucha?" and then trying it out and testing out the flavors. And I think for food brands, that kind of what I like to call that series is sampling at scale. So you're doing these one-on-one interactions, but by virtue of recording it and putting it on TikTok, many of these videos can perform quite well, a couple 100,000 views. You now have so many more people who are sampling that product,
sure,
even though it's just one person trying it out.
Totally.
And I would use that to kind of leverage local demand in the area, because TikTok has this nice benefit of like still keeping content somewhat localized.
Right. Amazing. I feel like at the end of the day, it should be like democratizing like success, right? Like, yeah. So, all right. So if you're going to talk about like consumer brands and content, I feel like it's impossible not to mention Liquid Death, which you've described as a company that's selling a commodity and therefore their primary goal should be entertainment and brand awareness. I'm interested, like from your perspective, how does Liquid Death manage to pull this off?
I think they have very little red tape at the company.
Okay.
They have serious creative guts in that they'll put out ideas and they're just willing to do it without defanging the idea. So what I mean by defanging the idea is oftentimes like you can kind of be on large teams and someone has this crazy out there idea. And then as a team, the idea gets watered down because it just becomes more logical and rational, the more people kind of chime in. Liquid Death, I think, fights that. They just have a good internal structure where they're like, no, that's the idea. We're going to go do that thing. We're going to go pull out Tony Hawk's blood and sell it. Right. We're going to change the Arnold Palmer to the dead billionaire name. So they take those creative risks and they're not scared about alienating people, about pissing people off. They know that controversy is the kind of heart of their marketing strategy and brand and puts their fans into this loyalist camp.
Right. So do you think that's transferable to other commodities?
I think you could do it in every commodity business.
Okay.
Can you build a team that has the great creative genius of Liquid Death? I think that's a secondary question.
Yeah, I feel like my question is like, I bet you could do it for a couple of years. I'm curious, like it's hard for anyone to be funny for decades, right? So like if you're building this brand, like how sustainable is it to be the most entertaining guy on the block?
Yeah, and I think that Liquid Death I think Liquid Death is very aware of this, right? For how long can we be funny and attention grabbing in doing this before there's just a general consumer fatigue of what we're doing? And so alongside of everything that they're doing great from their digital marketing side and stunts and so on, they're also pretty aggressive about getting distribution, whether that's through Live Nation, whether it's through grocers and convenience stores and so on. And that's the real kind of long-term sustainability of these businesses.
I want to get onto the sustainability part because I think that's my greatest interest probably with this entire series is trying to understand like, okay, like where's food going to go? But like, let's push it in a better place, hopefully. In a recent video you did about Neutral Milk's rebrand, you kind of talked about how most people at the grocery store, like I said earlier, are too tired to care probably about noble causes like in the immediate moment. They want to know if something tastes good and how much it costs. And like, I think we kind of covered this in our non-alcoholic episode, but I think the non-alcoholic companies that lean into flavor over like adaptogens and things that might make you feel better are the ones that are better suited for long-term success. So I'm curious about how you think a brand whose mission is to do things sustainably or more ethically, how they can really position themselves against competitors that might be disinterested in that sort of thing, or at least not as outwardly about it.
Yeah, I think to two companies, one in food and then one just that I've always liked. Patagonia in fashion, completely different category, has such an ethos of sustainability, both in sustainability of their, production processes and supply chain, sustainability in their corporate culture. But when you go in, you're buying the Patagonia clothes because they look good and they are hyper functional.
Totally.
And they do what I need. And so that's the kind of real hook. They understand, hey, the real hook for the mass market consumer is really this thing has to look good and it has to function in a great way. And they've been around for decades now, 30, 40 years. And so there's some subset of consumer who's coming in and saying, oh, I'm buying them because they're more sustainable and environmentally friendly and eco-conscious and so on. But that actually tends to be this story or narrative that's told by Patagonia over time through so many different brand touch points. So when you go in and you say, hey, I'm buying a new jacket, they'll say, oh, do you have an existing Patagonia jacket? Because we'll just repair that. And then you start to learn about their sustainability angle through initiatives like that. So I think there's plenty of lessons to look at from Patagonia, right? They're not jamming it down your throat as the kind of average consumer looking at their brand. A similar thing strikes me with this brand, Tony's Chocolonely, which is their whole thing is to end slavery in the supply chain of chocolate. I made a video on them, and the number one comment in there was, I didn't know this, but I love this brand because the chocolate is the best chocolate I've ever tasted. And that, to me, captures everything that Tony's is doing right. They are... Sure, they have the social mission and social impact on the back end of everything, but right now they are just standing out in aisles with their bright chocolate packaging and fun branding, and they're delivering a really good product experience, and then they're using that to support all of these things on the back end, which a smaller minority of their consumer base is going to care about.
Right, and I feel like it's why partially things like Impossible Meats and other meat alternatives kind of struggle. If it doesn't taste good, I don't want to do it. And I only really care about the emissions to a certain extent, even as someone that really gives a shit about this stuff. I don't know. And then so I kind of want to cover too, just a last question here. I really appreciate you taking the time today, but moving beyond short form video, do you think that there's an overlooked area or sort of an underappreciated area, content stream where brands that maybe are getting into food production could kind of lean into for growth? Almost like what TikTok would have been 3-4 years ago.
I don't know. If I knew, might be doing it.
Right.
I would say there's something, I've heard some people talk about Twitch and just the power of Twitch streamers. And I think there's probably a whole interesting opportunity there, an angle to go after. I want to say there was a food brand that did something very interesting on OnlyFans.
It doesn't have to be food either. I mean, I think it's funny looking back at you go on Twitter, you have someone oh, TikTok's gonna be the future, man, and you're roll your eyes, then you look up 3 years later and then you're making TikToks, right? And I'm just curious if it's not around right now. I'm sure it'll be in a year or two there will be that new platform, but I imagine that you probably would have a better grasp on it than I would. So I'm just curious if that's if there's one of those things that's starting to bubble up a little bit.
I think. Not yet. I don't think there's a new platform yet. There might be an existing platform that's just as a underappreciated opportunity. I think the one thing on TikTok that TikTok has proven is that they move very, very quickly on the design front, on the engineering front. And those changes that TikTok makes to the UX and product experience changes everything for consumers and merchants, especially as they lean into things like TikTok Shop and commerce. And so if TikTok plays their cards right, they will hold this period for, the same amount of period that maybe Facebook was able to or Instagram was able to.
Yeah. Do you have anything new coming down the pipeline that you're excited about? Whether it's brands that you're working with or anything it seems like you like starting companies. Yeah. Are there areas that you're kind of deep in?
Painful thing to doing.
I imagine it sounds awful.
Painful.
Are you deep in on anything right now? Oh, this could be a place where there's some room for innovation or...
Yeah, I am one brand that I am helping launch that I'm very excited about is in concert with a skin cancer surgeon and cosmetic dermatologist. Basically formulated a supplement that's a once daily drinkable that protects your skin against sun damage. and more specifically for people who have a history of skin cancer or have had skin cancer in the family, it's something that can reduce their risk of skin cancer by 30%.
You're kidding
in
me.
a once daily drinkable supplement. So, yeah.
What's the name of that?
It's called sun powder.
Okay. I got a precancerous mole removed when I was 7 years old.
Oh, wow.
My mom had melanoma. That would be exactly something I like could take with my magnesium every morning.
Yeah. Let me send some your way then.
That would be amazing.
Yeah.
Hell yeah. I feel like that's like when those work, it's so great. But I always am like we were saying on the other pod where it's just like, dude, I'm so tired of like the better for you shit where like I imagine you're deep in like this works. Like there's provable research behind this.
Yes. Was the first thing that kind of attracted me to this was the fact that it was a skin cancer surgeon who's been practicing for like 15 years. Has come to me and he's like, hey, this is the concept. This is the product. This is the need that I have for getting this kind of medication and these compounds to my patients. And I have all of the research and I can stand by every single ingredient and explain ad nauseum how it is helpful for you. So it's almost like that's a thing where I wouldn't even categorize it in like a better for you space. It's just like, hey, it's a supplement in drinkable form, basically. Right. But the better for you space is, it's rough. It is rough.
Well, thank you for that. Can you tell everyone where they can find you and everything more about yourself here?
Yes. I'm most easily found on Instagram and TikTok at Schwinnabago.
Awesome. Well, Ashwinn, thank you for coming by today.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Awesome.